In 2016, Fantasy Flight published The Investigators of Arkham Horror as a companion book to their Arkham Horror games and novels. And despite the fact that I'm someone who has never played or read any of those and is only vaguely interested in the Cthulhu mythos, I am nonetheless a huge sucker for immersive fiction, and that one was so impressive and I absolutely loved it. I recommend that you check out that review first, not only because I'll be referencing it, but also because there are a lot of elements that this book has in common, and I don't want to waste the time of people who have already seen that review repeating too much of the same stuff. One thing I mentioned in that video was that after Investigators of Arkham, Fantasy Flight published a deluxe edition rulebook that contained a 30-page section called Welcome to Arkham, and it was a guide to some of the locations found in the city, which sounded really cool, but kind of sucked that half of what you were getting was also a rulebook, which doesn't really make sense to me, because Arkham Horror players would already own the rules, while players of the other games in the franchise or fans of the novels, i.e. people interested in the lore but don't care about the rules part, so ultimately felt like a rather silly product for so little content. But then in 2024, to my supreme delight, Fantasy Flight and their sibling company Aconite Books took that location guidebook idea and expanded it into its own whole book. And to be clear, this full book contains all the locations from the deluxe rulebook and basically the exact same write-ups, but has taken it from like 30 locations to 150. And not just for Arkham either, it also covers Dunwich, Innsmouth, and Kingsport. Miskatonic University is also essentially its own whole section, rather than just treating the school as one location, one page entry. Also, I read that apparently some of the locations appear here for the first time in the franchise, which is really cool because it suggests to me that there's actually exclusive information in here offering something even for those who have read everything. This was also possibly confirmed by cases where I would Google a character's name and couldn't find anything, which could mean they debut here, but please, if my lack of knowledge in this franchise results in anything in this video being incorrect or overlooked, I encourage those better informed to set the record straight or add insight to anything I've said in the comments. Investigators of Arkham was basically an illustrated storybook that had some immersive accompaniments in the form of various in-world documents. Welcome to Arkham, on the other hand, makes the much better decision to dive into those immersive aspects and have the whole book presented as an in-world publication that exists in Arkham. So the premise is that Welcome to Arkham is a visitor's guide to all the municipal locations, businesses, sites of interest for the various towns, written by the Arkham Historical Society's curator. This isn't just any old copy of the book, it's the curator's personal one, and so is filled with additional documents and his handwritten notes relating to some mystery he's been investigating. However, he's disappeared, and the book is now in the possession of his niece, who's also added her own ephemera and notes as she investigates the mystery through the book as it leads her through Arkham and beyond. When I understood that this book had a running meta-narrative, I was so impressed because it's such a good idea, both creatively and as a tool to add some sense of connected through line and context in a book that really needs it, because otherwise it's just a collection of descriptions about buildings. So it's a marvelous idea, in theory, because in practice it is the only genuinely terribly done, pointless disappointment in the book. It is a tacked-on, no-effort afterthought. The story is just a sparse, boring, uninspired string-along that somehow still manages to end in an anticlimax. I feel like, I hope, I'm missing something, some twist or greater import that's gone over my head, because otherwise, as a device, story, mystery feature of the book, it's nothing. And that's my biggest disappointment because of how good and powerful the idea is and how it could have contributed to this book to only be pointlessly squandered, poorly used with no effort or enthusiasm. Unfortunately, although the narrative text is by far the worst, the most important part, the main text that is each of the entries, feels more like a misguided tour, to say the least, with 90% of it simply being so incredibly boring and unambitious, which is at complete odds with the book's concept and especially the visual presentation, which are of such masterful high effort. I'll get into that later. As far as the book's concept, I love the specific scope and focus it has. Such a better idea than the sort of lore books that try to cram their entire universe into one volume. However, although this shows good judgment and the book nonetheless still benefits more than had it not done that, the execution is so lacking that, as with too many of its great ideas, it ends up pointlessly unrealized potential. Although I'm not sure I'd go so far as to call the main text bad, but it is oddly weak and limited in its realization, creativity, and impact, and especially does not live up to the visuals, concept, or even the world of Arkham, supremely lacking in the same level of effort and really any sort of awareness of being of interest to readers. So the way it works, each location location gets a page with 30 to 50% being text. That text is made up of the most superficial, banal descriptions of its locations, its history and occupants, and then maybe a sentence or two that hint at some sort of strangeness or mystery, and that's if you're lucky, because many locations are literally just a pedestrian description of a restaurant or a church or a bridge that could be anywhere in the real world. There's nothing Arkham or even interesting about them. Obviously, some of the more inherently spooky locations are exceptions to this, but overall I was not only disappointed, but actually surprised by how little this book displays in terms of its genre fiction elements, except for maybe crime fiction, but weirdness, horror, mystery, pulp adventure, it touches on those things only in the lightest and sparse sense. 90% of this book just feels like I'm reading the most shallow 1920s gazetteer. The whole point and appeal of this world feels so bizarrely underused. And listen, I understand and appreciate the logic that is possibly behind this. First of all, that's kind of the recipe for most horror and weird fiction. Present normalcy, hint at something beneath the surface, explore the mystery, and then have a flash encounter with the fantastical. That scarcity works in storytelling and gaming situations where the narrative and game elements are the entertainment that carries you along. Whereas with this book, not only is the ratio way off, with 90% being the normalcy part, but it also doesn't work very well in something like this that really only has world building and lore to provide that continual entertainment and interest. If we were talking about a sci-fi or fantasy world, it'd be a different story because they're more exotic locations. But here we're reading basic, obvious, or just uninteresting information about what could be any old park. And this is coming from someone who's very unacquainted with this world. It should have all been fresh and exciting. But I feel like I could have written this just based simply on an ability to come up with any old commonplace diner and then occasionally say something like, there are rumors of tunnels beneath. Unexplained tunnels and bootleggers seem to be this book's main go-tos when it needs to fabricate interest for a location in a pinch. Of course, there are also absolutely really good entries, details, hooks, and elements that do showcase the world and use its eldritch shadows in a much more exciting way, but that's by far the minority. The appeal and excitement of the setting is so unleveraged and underused. For example, the most fun section to read is Innsmouth, ironically because it's such a dismal, depressing hole that it has more character, but even then the book is still failing to present this world, because even something as basic as the Innsmouth look, though seen in the images, is never once mentioned in the text. You'd think a book like this would point out such a distinct local feature. And I get that some people will actually really like that it only has the lightest touch of the weird rather than being like, cultists and monsters on every corner. But the point is, without those elements that games and novels have, a book like this that's all about world building and lore requires those things to be more hard-hitting and apparent for the sake of identity, entertainment, and interest, since you're not getting that from reading rather pedestrian descriptions of buildings and businesses. I want to read about the freaky stuff that happened there. Without that, what's the appeal of this book? Because the reading experience is 90% of the sentences have me thinking, seriously, who cares? Now, you could say, well, since you haven't experienced the games or novels, you don't have the same connection and appreciation of these locations a real fan would. That's definitely true. However, I promise that is not what's going on here. I cannot believe that even for huge fans, 90% of the text here is still not interesting, entertaining, or in any other way meaningful. And I'm really surprised and disappointed that the book's creators don't seem to have any awareness of that. In fact, if anything, I would think true fans will find it even more boring and dissatisfying since, like I said, at least this is all fresh to me, where you may already know a lot of this. Though I will reiterate that I believe there is lore and such exclusive to this book, at least at present, so that's definitely a huge potential appeal, though take that claim with a grain of salt, and I'm hoping a more learned Arkham scholar will confirm or deny that in the comments, but whatever the case, I doubt you'll find the text as rewarding as you would like, with most of the information being mundane trivialities, because at the moment, too much of the book's appeal rests on its novelty, where it could have been so much stronger and more enjoyable beyond that had it spent less time on the humdrum surface and more time on the intrigue and excitement beneath it. Speaking of which, I also understand how, like Investigators of Arkham, this book only gives you a whiff of a weird mystery as a hook for you to then explore in the games and novels. I get that logic, I just don't think it's a very good idea. It made a little more sense for the Investigators book. Doing the same thing of presenting more questions than answers isn't satisfying for something like this that is closer to a lore book. i.e. something you go to for answers. Some people may disagree. I just don't think it's a good gimmick or one that I would want to pay for to wade through 90% of boring text just to get to, ooh, and here's a tidbit about something interesting, you should go and find out more about it elsewhere. First of all, there's no indication of where elsewhere is, but more importantly, no, I don't want a $60 ad for other products. Surely the purpose of a book like this is to collect the lore from various sources and explicitly present it in one convenient reference book. Plus, even just as an ad, I still found the hooks to be lacking in strength and presence to compel me to journey to Arkham and explore more, and so often even when it does attempt to present more intrigue, it feels meaningless because it's so vague and fleeting that I'm still left thinking, who cares? It feels like it wants you to go and fetch your reward elsewhere rather than giving it to you here. Now, you may say, but the conceit is that this is a real, historically minded publication in the world, so of course it's going to be pedestrian rather than weird. Sure, that makes sense, but then that's what the narrative layer should have been for, providing what the location entries were lacking. You have the guidebook presenting the surface layer of the town, and then overlaying is a narrator who's exploring a mystery, adding color, character, and engagement. But as I said, it's so poorly used that it's meaningless, despite the fact that it has two protagonists, the curator and his niece, but both are very weak in characterization and presence. I feel like it should have been a character who lends themselves to being a better protagonist for this kind of thing, a detective, a folklorist, to present the more explicitly weird and exciting aspects that the guidebook can't by virtue of its premise. But instead, the author once again is realizing a wonderful concept in the most perfunctory, mundane, even lazy way that it offers nothing. However, there's this one interesting section in the book that is kind of the exception that proves the rule regarding my issue with the lack of the Eldritch. So hidden in the guidebook is what is supposed to be a folder containing manuscript pages from the Book of Living Myth, and this is basically where they've relegated all the fantastical elements to. And yeah, on the one hand, it's really cool to finally get a bit more of that, but on the other, not only is it only like a dozen pages, but feels shorter, because even here the text is still so much basic, general waffling. There's a real dissonance between how explicit and exciting the images are, and how light and reserved most of the text is, just nowhere near as hard-hitting. It feels really odd how infrequently the images and text seem to match the same vibe. Text in this section still has the coolest stuff, and I really enjoyed that they found a fun way to deliver on more of it more directly, and yet, as with the rest of the book, because it is just a brisk, barest scratch of the surface, that rather than addressing my dissatisfaction with how underused the setting's potential is, kind of just ends up highlighting and exacerbating it, proving it further and putting into stark contrast how absent it is from the trivialities that make up 90% of the rest of the book. Again, I want to stress I understand the ideas behind this book, but they need rethinking and better execution in order to make it work. The book's text is very similar to what you would read in an RPG campaign setting for a city or town, which is why I think the reader who will definitely get the most from this book is if you are running a mythos-based or inspired campaign. One better move the main text does make to add a little more interest in character is that sometimes as much as half an entry will be about the character or characters associated with the location. It might seem a little strange that there is quite a bit of focus on the inhabitants when, one, it doesn't really conform to the idea that this is an actual guide, that it would have these very specific personality descriptions, and two, because there already was a character-focused book. But I don't feel it unnecessarily repeats or treads on the feet of the investigator's book, thank goodness, so it's ultimately a wise and necessary move that definitely alleviates some of the boredom. Even so, it doesn't really amount to much given that they're such short, general personality snapshots, but like so much of this universe, it's when those names crop up in other parts of the book that they start contributing to something more engaging than the sum parts. Speaking of which, even though they take different approaches, this book still pairs really well with the investigators of Arkham. Like any good work contributing to a shared world, each amplifies and enriches the other. And this is where we finally get into the great things about this book. So in my Investigators of Arkham review, I mentioned the two things that I thought could have made that book even better were more of its two best elements. One, more frequent and stronger references to reinforce the rich, connected nature of this shared world, and two, more of the ephemera and documents. And it's just so great to see that they've identified and doubled down on these things that made the earlier books so impressive. In terms of the shared world and interreferencing, I don't know that the connections are any stronger in the sense of being more profound, and definitely still could be used more frequently and meaningfully, but it is an improvement over the Investigators of Arkham, which is great because in my opinion, they're the most fun part about this book and really Arkham Horror overall. I think Fantasy Flight has done a stellar job of presenting a shared universe from what I've seen, though, as ever, take my neophyte impression with a grain of salt, but while reading the book I was absolutely doing my due diligence in terms of Googling everything to understand the references. You know, something will be vaguely referenced in the book that's an allusion to an event from one of these scenarios from a game or or a character from one of the novels. And by novels, I don't just mean Lovecraft's writing, of course, but also the Arkham horror novels that Aconite also publishes. Again, these references aren't really profound or even meaningful in a more immediate sense. Really, like the other book, they're just Easter eggs, if that. All it is just, hey, it's that thing from the other thing. I don't know why, but I just find it so consistently delightful. These connections solidify, deepen, enrich, and enliven the world building, as well as engagement and reward, because I have to imagine the more you've read and experienced, the more you pick up on and get joy out of that stuff. But my absolute favorite thing about this book, like The Investigators of Arkham, is these supporting immersive documents and ephemera. Granted, really, they only amount to decoration and novelty rather than anything that is technically integral, and yeah, it would have been even cooler if they were, but even so, the ephemera contributes immensely by making the world feel real and lived in, particularly important for anything dealing with the mythos, which has a rich tradition of pseudo-biblia and such established even before Lovecraft with the King in Yellow. Additionally, not only are the documents in such spectacular in the high-effort uniqueness and attention to detail for each piece like the Investigators book, but even better simply because there are more of them. The content and visual density and quantity are incredible, a huge improvement on the Investigators book. Some people find many of the artworks too small compared to what you would expect from an art book, which I mean, yeah, but honestly I don't think it's the sort of art that needs to be any bigger, and this book benefits far more from the quantity because these locations are better expressed visually than descriptively. And just as a visual book, I find it much more appealing and rewarding than the Investigators, which had much larger images and far fewer elements per page. So even though Welcome to Arkham has like half as many pages, it feels like it contains twice as much stuff. In fact, it's so good with how much it crams in at its best that then there are some pages that feel dissatisfying for not living up to that. Like just by comparison, there are also plenty of uncharacteristic instances of blank real estate that you'd think they would have filled with more images, documents, or definitely handwritten notes in the margins. Because there are only a couple of those used throughout, which is another very unimpressively underused element that it had the space for and would have allowed the protagonist to add more context, character, and engagement throughout. But back to the artworks, personally I found this to be a really interesting example of how context can affect the appreciation of art, because the artworks, just viewed individually, personally, I don't think they're that great, either in terms of quality or interest. Like there's no way I would buy an art book where they are the focus, but in this book they're sharing the focus with a lot of other elements so they don't have as much pressure on them. And so in this context, I actually really like their use and inclusion, and I feel they work far better here than they would in a straight-up art book, so that's great. I think it's pretty clear that the visual components, graphic design, ephemera are magnificent and what makes this book, which is awesome, but also kind of a shame that they're doing pretty much all of the heavy lifting without much help from the text, and so the visuals and text are at complete odds, with the former being so high effort, skillful and engaging and lives up to what an amazing idea for a book this is. Meanwhile the text, at least in overall execution, is the complete opposite, frequently making me think what was even the point of doing a book like this. So yes, this is a book that offers more style than substance, and yet that's not as terrible as it might sound, given that in the case of a book like this, a lot of the style is substance because of the immersive experience. They're the things that engage you and make turning each page a delight, and so even if it's not a super enjoyable book to read, there's still joy to be had simply basking in it. I think Welcome to Arkham gets away with that to a degree thanks to the strength of its tethers to the world building of this franchise, its visual presentation, ephemera, and simply because books like this are all too rare. Even so, I just wish the joy didn't rely so heavily on its novelty due to the text being such a lackluster missed opportunity that prevented it from living up to its potential and being something greater in its own right, instead ending up with something rather flat. Lastly, there are a couple of other minor areas the book has some strange lapses in thought and execution. So the only real screw-up the Investigators of Arkham made was the index was bizarrely bad, but at least it had one. This book's even worse, because it doesn't, which for a reference-heavy lore book like this would have been handy. Also, unlike Investigators, this book neglects to credit the specific artwork to its artist, instead just lumping all the artists together as a thanks. For all my praise of how amazing and high-effort the design and ephemera are, as well as praise for how well both books work together, this is disappointingly undermined a tad by the number of repeated artworks already present in the Investigators book. Now, it's somewhat understandable in that they only have a limited pool of existing works to draw from that are applicable to the locations, and really many of the pieces feel more appropriate here, and so the Investigators book should have used other ones, but obviously it was created first, so it's sort of a what can you do situation. Well, you can always create more art, but even so, considering the situation, I feel like there was still plenty of unnecessary overlap. Now, while I have some sympathy and understanding regarding the repeated artworks, that does not extend to the repeated ephemera, which is an inexcusably and uncharacteristically cheap, lazy inclusion. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a serious issue, but it does put a mark on the otherwise high opinion of one of the book's best and most impressive aspects. Also, I did already mention some odd areas of free real estate I would have expected the book to fill with more content, whether images, documents, or handwritten notes. The only other misstep on the part of the design are the occasional cases where a full-color artwork is given a sort of sketchy black and white filter, which is just completely unnecessary effect that makes them look worse. Again, just weird, poor judgment from designers who otherwise display the complete opposite. But by far the most glaring omission from this book that you may have already noticed is the lack of any maps. In my Investigators of Arkham review, I mentioned I would have liked a map, but understood that the Arkham horror game uses modular layout for the city. But if you decide to do a book like this that is all about the geography, giving specific street names, that excuse is not good enough. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, and it's not working. The world building of the whole franchise shouldn't be suffering due to an early game mechanic that doesn't make any sense outside of a gameplay feature. You can't put so much import on the geography of your world building that it warrants a guidebook, but then refuse to commit to it via the most basic manifestation of that, being a map. And this time around I'm confident it's a legitimate criticism because pretty much every other review I've read, presumably by actual fans who have the authority to claim this is a valid issue, have also complained about this. Then there's also just various specific instances of errata or oversight throughout both text and visuals, but on a minor and individual level, not worth detailing here, though still worth mentioning that, even the core aside, there is evidence of the surface needing another polish at the very least.